is bias? Bias is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group when compared with another. Let's look at an example of a cross-cultural bias.
The English believe it's a slur on your host's food if you don't clear your plate. Whereas the Chinese feel you're questioning their generosity if you do. At HSBC, we never underestimate the importance of local knowledge. Which is why we have local banks staffed by local people in over 80 countries across the globe. HSBC, the world's local bank.
So now that we know what biases are, let's look at a brief history. Why do we differ across cultures? And the answer to that is our schemas. Our schemas are developed through our interactions with the world, and living in different cultures provides us with different experiences and environments. This leads into why our biases differ. And this is due to top-down processing. We use our schemas and past experiences in order to make sense of the world around us. This means that people with differing schemas will see things around them differently or with certain biases. Now, growing evidence indicates generalized differences in the attentional and cognitive processing of adults from Eastern and Western cultures. This stems from a difference in the environments of different cultures, leading to different cultures developing different schemas that affect how they see the world. So how do Eastern and Western cultures differ? Well, Western cultures tend to be more individualistic, hedonistic, and analytical, where they stress the self-uniqueness. Eastern cultures tend to be more collectivist, hedonistic, and holistic, focusing more on context of things rather than specific objects and materials.
So how is cultural bias relevant to our society? Let's start by defining what cultural bias is. It is known as interpreting and/or judging the behavior and psychological characteristics of one culture by comparing it to your own. So, if we're biased towards other cultures, we would have difficulty distinguishing how cultures are actually different, rather than how we perceive them to be different due to a bias in our system of measurement. Some examples of this bias are shown here. One can be how an American might view non-Western relationships as unfair or oppressive to women relative to Western relationships. Another example is shown in this cartoon here. It shows a variety of animals of different sizes, weights, and capabilities in a row. The proctor at the front then states that, to be fair, they will all be asked to take the same exam. Now climb that tree. In this case, the proctor is exhibiting a cultural bias. He is assuming that his students all come from cultures or backgrounds similar to his own, and thus should be able to complete the same tests as he once did. He is comparing their backgrounds and cultures to his own and is not finding a difference, even though in reality there actually is. Now that we've gone into what cultural bias can look like, let's explore how cultural bias relates to neurobiology.
So the first brain region we're going to look at is the lateral occipital complex, but first let's go into some background. Previous experiments have shown that Westerners seem to be more object-focused, whereas East Asians seem to be more context-focused, or more focused on the relationship between the object and context it's within. In addition, many of these studies looking at differences in brain activity use BOLD adaptations. BOLD stands for blood oxygen level dependent, which means the amount of oxygen consumed by brain tissue and can be used as a metric for brain activity. Specifically, differences in BOLD adaptations have been found in cultural studies between the PPA, or the parahippocampal place area, and the LOC, or lateral occipital complex. The PPA seems to respond more to object changes, whereas the LOC seems to respond more to changes in background. One important piece of evidence which led to the current study is researchers observed greater BOLD adaptation in the right lateral occipital complex of elderly American subjects compared to elderly Chinese subjects. This indicates possible involvement of the lateral occipital complex in perceptual bias differences due to culture. Before going into the specifics of the study, here's an image of the lateral occipital complex in the brain. It's located towards the outside portion bilaterally of the occipital lobe, which is at the caudal portion, or the back, of the brain. So this study consisted of a subject pool of 16 American subjects and 16 Chinese subjects. All of the American subjects were native English speakers, of non-Asian heritage, and all of the Chinese subjects were native Mandarin speakers and had been in the US for less than 1.5 years. This was important because it helped to minimize the cross-cultural overlap between the two groups. Prior to the experimental phase, subjects were shown 200 images in a randomized order. This was done in order to first locate the maximally responsive coordinate of the lateral occipital complex to get the best imaging results, and also to remove any images which presented with an inherent difference in perception due to cultural bias. In the experimental phase, sequences of images followed 4 different conditions and a specific timing paradigm. In these sequences of presentation, an image was shown for 1500 milliseconds, followed by a 250 millisecond break, followed by the next picture. This process was repeated until all images were shown. The 4 sequence categories of images shown were novel congruent, where each image was novel from the previous, but the object remained congruent with the background; repeated congruent, where the image was repeated and the object remained congruent with the background; novel incongruent, where each subsequent image was novel and the object was not congruent with the background; and repeated incongruent, where each subsequent image had the same object and same background as the previous. As subjects viewed these sequences of images on a computer screen, the researchers observed their brain activity using fMRI. As an image was shown, the researchers were able to see which regions were more activated and which were less activated. Specifically, they looked at the peak bold activity and the time point directly following, which is what they referred to as peak +1. Through their experiment, the researchers found that there was a significant interaction between congruence and culture at the peak +1 time point in the LOC. Specifically, they found that Chinese subjects showed greater bold adaptation to incongruent images in both the left and right LOC, and American subjects showed greater bold adaptation to congruent images in both the left LOC and right LOC. So what does this mean? The results showed greater object processing, or greater bold adaptation magnitude, in Chinese subjects for incongruent contexts. This means that context had a more significant effect on their visual perception of an object, whereas American subjects showed less attentional bias for objects violating normal contexts. In other words, an American's visual perception of an object is more removed from the context it applies. These results suggest that prolonged exposure to a given culture can alter processes underlying visual perception, and that the lateral occipital complex is directly involved in these processes.
As we examine how visual processing differences between East Asians and Americans can influence cultural biases, it is also important to analyze how the neurobiological differences between the two groups can correspond with their respective cultures. As mentioned previously in this presentation and in multiple studies, East Asians tend to process this information with a greater emphasis on the context of the situation, leading to a more holistic approach. Westerners, on the other hand, tend to process information in a more object-focused manner, leading to a more analytical approach. In one particular study, Michael Chi and his research team looked at how differences in cultural biases in regards to perception are accompanied by differences in brain structure. The study mainly focuses on the differences in thickness of gray matter and structural volume between East Asians and Americans. This study recruited a total of 140 participants, 70 of which were non-Asian Americans and 70 of which were Chinese Singaporeans. Of these two subgroups, there were both old subjects with a mean age of 64 years old and young subjects with a mean age of 21 to 22 years old. To carry out this experiment, researchers used neuropsychological assessment, cultural values questionnaires, and functional imaging data to cross-reference differences in culture and brain structures. The results of this study showed that in terms of cultural values, Singaporeans had higher rankings in items indicative of collectivistic values such as benevolence, tradition, conformity, security, and power. Higher scores in these areas is consistent with cultures that are more community-centered. Americans, on the other hand, scored higher in hedonism. This is consistent with the American culture, which is more individualistic in that personal aspirations and satisfaction are often prioritized over community. The results of this study showed that there was higher cortical thickness in American youth versus Singaporean youth in polymodal association areas. There was also higher cortical thickness in Singaporean individuals in the left inferior temporal gyrus. This figure shows the results of the study. As you can see, in the left inferior temporal lobe, the US group has significantly less gray matter than the Singaporean group, as shown by the blue region. In the polymodal association areas bilaterally, there is significantly more gray matter in the US group than in the Singaporean group, as shown by the red-orange regions. So, how do these differences in cortical thickness relate to cultural biases? We can look at where these differences in cortical thickness occur and hypothesize about its relationship to forming these biases. In the American group, the study revealed that these individuals displayed higher cortical thickness in polymodal association areas. These areas participate in integrating information from more than one sensory modality to create a focused, object-centric image. This is consistent with an analytical method of processing information. We can hypothesize that this may relate to how Americans have a more individualistic culture, where they tend to focus more on one person than the entire community. In the Singaporean group, the study revealed that these individuals displayed higher cortical thickness in the left inferior temporal gyrus. This area participates in processing visual information from the surroundings and context to create a more cohesive image. This is consistent with the holistic method of processing information. We can hypothesize that this may relate to how Singaporeans have a more collectivistic culture, where they tend to focus on their community more than the self.
Now let's look at how biases affect object processing across different cultures. Behavioral research suggests that Westerners focus more on objects, whereas East Asians attend more to relationships and contexts. In order to measure levels of object attention, researchers focused their attention on parts of the brain that were involved in object processing. Let's look at some brain areas involved in object or contextual processing. First off, the left superior parietal gyrus is involved in spatial orientation and successful tracking and encoding of object locations. The supramarginal gyrus also attends to spatial information and is also activated when tracking and giving attention to an object. The lateral middle temporal cortex, in particular, stores knowledge about object properties and is selectively engaged in the retrieval of semantic knowledge during object perception. Finally, the fusiform gyrus is involved in perceptual and contextual processing, rather than object processing, and activates when paying attention to the contextual properties of an image. In this study, 11 Americans and 11 East Asians completed 2 experimental sessions, a pretest followed by an actual scan. In a pretest session, participants completed a demographic questionnaire and 2 speed of processing tasks. This was done in order to control for any cognitive differences that would affect the test results. For the actual scan, 120 pictures and 60 fixation cross baselines were presented for 4 seconds each. During the 4-second presentation interval, the participants rated how pleasant they found the picture, involving object only, background only, or a combined picture, and rated it based on pleasant, neutral, or unpleasant ratings. This was done to create a deeper processing of the image. Researchers were able to create 2 masks, one object regions mask, containing regions more active for objects than backgrounds, and one background regions mask, containing regions more active for backgrounds rather than objects. These masks were then used during the fMRI scans to measure the activation of both object processing and background processing masks or regions of the brain. Researchers found that Americans activated more regions within the object-specific mask than did East Asians. Specifically, the left superior parietal gyrus, the supramarginal gyrus, and the left middle temporal gyrus that were discussed previously. This figure here shows these 3 regions activating greater in Americans than for East Asians during an object-specific mask. Researchers also found that in the background-specific mask, East Asians activated regions more involved in perceptual and contextual processing than did Americans. Specifically, the fusiform gyrus. In this image here, you can see the activation of the fusiform gyrus for East Asians was greater than for Americans, showing that they focus more on perceptual processing. So what does this show us? Americans showed increased object-based processing, which was consistent with the finding that Americans attend to individual objects more so than do East Asians. This was shown with the increased activation of the brain regions involved in object processing. It also shows that Western culture is indeed more analytical, object-oriented, and focused on semantics. East Asians, however, showed increased background processing, which was consistent with the more perceptual processing via the fusiform gyrus to encode pictures without the extensive activation of property-specific and semantic processing regions. This is consistent with the findings that Eastern cultures tend to be more holistic and focused on perceptions and meanings as well as contexts. The differences in object processing contribute to cultural differences in picture encoding and object processing. Both of these results show us that our culture affects neural function when nonverbal stimuli are processed, and reveal that cultural experiences shape and engage our neural systems associated with learning and memory, which leads to biases in what we give our attention to and how we process the world around us.
The results of these studies come with many implications in the field of cross-cultural biases, namely, that culture can affect how we interact with the world on a biological level. In the scope of vision, one way we can address these biases is by adapting visual styles of teaching to fit a larger variety of cultural strengths in the classroom. The results of these studies also have implications in linguistics. We can see just how different Chinese and English styles of writing appear, and we begin to ask ourselves, how much does linguistic structure affect the way that we think, and in what ways? Finally, we can even see the cross-cultural differences in visual perception in art. We can see the importance of context in this famous Chinese painting, and the emphasis on the focal objects in this famous American painting. In seeing these differences, we can begin to appreciate cross-cultural differences even more fully, and particularly from a visual perspective.